Hello everybody, Treno here, and welcome to this next episode of my series looking at interwar tanks that I think should be added to War Thunder. And today we will be taking a look at the Soviet tanks of the interwar period. So like in the previous episodes, we'll do a quick recap of the situation after World War I. Of course, the big thing you might have noticed is that Russia is now the Soviet Union. And of course, the situation during World War I is a large part of why that happened. Of course, Russia had suffered horrendous losses in World War I, in fact more than any other Entente power, which helped lead to two revolutions which brought an end to the monarchy and the rise of the Bolsheviks, which was then followed by the Russian exit from World War I via the harsh Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and then they had to fight and win a civil war against domestic enemies and many of their former allies that intervened to various degrees to support the Bolsheviks' enemies. And of course, by the end of this, Russia was now part of the USSR and focusing on recovering and rebuilding after the various conflicts. However, despite all of these setbacks, the lack of tank development during World War I, and the rather limited tank production during the Civil War, the Soviet Union would go on to become a major player in tank development during the interwar period, producing far more tanks than any other nation, and indeed producing some rather good designs for the era, which would of course lead to the famous Russian World War II designs, like the T-34 and KV-1. So for the first tank designs, we will be taking a look at the T-16 and T-18 light tanks, the latter otherwise known as the MS-1, and these were essentially a continuation of the Russian Renault, thus these had a similar layout and stats. So this started off as the T-16 light tank design, with design work beginning in 1926, so a bit later than some other nations, but once the design was produced, it was decided that improvements were needed for the suspension, which would lead in 1928 to the T-18 design. This was armed with a 37mm gun at the front left of the turret, this either being the short 37mm gun from the FT-17 or a Hotchkiss 1-pounder gun, the latter being the more effective weapon, while two 6.5mm machine guns are placed at the front right in a ball mount, which allows for limited traverse, though will likely be harder to use than a standard coaxial machine gun mount. Then moving on to the armour, this maxes out at about 8 to 16mm, which isn't particularly great but not the worst in the world either, while the top speed is 10 miles per hour, and a crew of 2 is carried, this being a driver and gunner, which does make this design unfortunately a bit susceptible to one-shot kills in-game, as you only need to lose one crew member. In-game, I think these would play very similar to the Russian Renaults at 0.7, with these designs being only a minor improvement, mainly with regards to speed. But as the first wholly domestically designed Soviet tank to go into production, I feel this tank should be added and would be a good stepping stone from the earlier World War I tanks to the interwar period. So it was quickly realised that a new tank design would be needed, but the T-18 still went into production in 1928, and a whopping 960 examples would still be produced, making this tank design one of the larger production runs of the 1920s and a massive achievement for Soviet industry at the time. And it's kind of easy to see why they still put this tank into production, because it's very easy to say that you've designed and produced a singular tank in your specialised factory, but you then need to have the ability to actually mass produce it. So even if this wasn't the best design in the world, it gave Soviet industry experience in mass producing tanks, so it still had a very good effect on Soviet industry. Some of these tanks would go on to see combat service in border conflicts on the border with China in 1929, while a few survived to see combat in Operation Barbarossa, with many having their 37mm guns replaced by the more modern 45mm guns. Though even with this upgrade, they were still outmatched by the Germans and didn't fare very well against modern panzers. So while the T-18 was a good enough stopgap tank for the moment, the Soviets had already started designing a replacement in the form of the T-19 light tank, which was envisioned as a better, more modern looking design than the earlier T-18. One of the main improvements of this design was the increased crew complement of 3, which allowed for greater delegation of duties in real life and lessens the chances of one-shot kills in-game. Speed was also improved, now maxing out at 16.7 miles per hour. Again, a good improvement over the T-18 and Russian Renault, while the armour still maxes out at 16mm, and it's armed with a 37mm gun, possibly the M1930, which is a much more modern gun, while two 7.62mm DT machine guns were also carried, one in a coaxial position and one in the bow. In War Thunder, I think the T19 could be added at around battle rating 1.0, and in many ways this seems to be a Soviet equivalent to the French NC-1, giving us a decent tank with good armament, mobility and crew. Though the armour is unlikely to stand up to serious firepower, but it should still give good service to players in War Thunder. So the T19 was a good improvement over the T18, but very few would be produced, for reasons that we'll get into in a little while. But during this time period there were also attempts to produce a domestically designed Soviet medium tank, one of which would be designated initially as the T12, with lessons learnt from the experience of designing the previous tanks helping with the design. The design work would be carried out at the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, with one of the designers being involved being Alexander Morozov, who would go on to help design many Soviet tanks in the next few decades. The T-12's turret was 8-sided, and there was a small turret or commander's cupola mounted atop of it, which does provide a prominent target for enemies, while the turret itself housed the Model 32 45mm gun, aka the same one as on the T-26. So this is a pretty effective gun for the low tiers, while three 7.62mm DT machine guns were also carried in ball mounts, one to the right of the main gun, one on the left side of the turret and one in the commander's cupola, providing good all-round fire for against soft-skin targets. Meanwhile, the top speed was around 16 miles per hour, and the armour thickness ranged from 12 to 22mm, which isn't the worst armour protection in the world, and certainly better than earlier models, but the prototype was also constructed with construction steel rather than armour steel, which could affect things. It was also fitted with a tail that could be fitted to increase the length of the tank and help with crossing trenches. Lastly, the crew complement was 4, with a driver in the hull and the commander, gunner and loader in the turret, again giving some redundancy against crew losses in-game. The prototype was finished in October 1929 and underwent testing, where it was decided to alter the design to fix numerous flaws that had come up, with the new design being redesignated as the T-24. The new design kept some features from the T-12, such as the 45mm gun and prominent commander's cupola. More changes were made, such as the armour now ranging from 8 to 20mm thick, so slightly worse than the original T-24, but not by much, and the turret is now rounded at the rear, so in theory is better at deflecting shots. The hull is also wider, and the upper tracks are now lower down than on the T-12. In War Thunder, I think both tanks could work at around 0.7 to 1.0, as they have a pretty decent gun and good crew complement, if not the best top speed or protection. But they would be a good stepping stone from the earlier light tanks to the more modern medium tanks like the T-28, and would do decently enough in game. The T-24 would be put through trials in 1931, though without the 45mm gun, as there was none available at the time, and despite the engine catching fire during the trials, which does seem like a bit of a problem, 300 would be ordered for production. However, only 25 would be produced, possibly due to design flaws or the design being too complex, but also possibly due to the reasons we'll touch on in a minute. There was, however, a competing design to the T-24, which was the T-22 or TG-1, sometimes known as the Tank Grotta, which was a rather unusual tank that was designed by a team in Leningrad led by German engineer Eduard Grotta. Germany, as you might recall from previous episodes, was still technically banned from owning tanks, but the Soviet Union had allowed Germany to test its tank designs at Kama, with the Soviets getting access to what they had learnt in return. For example, the Soviet tanker helmets are basically based on a German design, and it seems that coaxial machine guns were also taken from German designs. And as we can see in this case, it seems that German engineers were in some demand as well. So as you can see, the TG-1 is a rather large and odd design, being armed with two main weapons: a 37mm gun in an upper turret and a long 76mm gun in what looks to be a casemate. Supposedly this was designed as a functioning turret, but either wasn't made to be functional for tests, or it was built functioning but broke down and was never fixed and just tested as it was. But in game it's possible it would be functional, making this a rather deadly tank, able to engage multiple targets or use both guns on one target to devastating effect. Though honestly, I can't imagine a situation where that 76mm gun doesn't one-shot most vehicles. In addition to the 2 main guns, it was also fitted with 5 machine guns, 2 either side of the main gun, 2 placed on the right and left side of the turret, and 1 at the rear of the turret, again giving good coverage against soft-skin vehicles in-game, but the large number of weapons would likely have left the 5-man crew overworked in real life, while in-game losing just 1 or 2 crew members will result in weapon reload times being increased, and if you lose too many crew members could possibly lead to losing access to certain weapons altogether. To move the massive vehicle, it was intended to be fitted with an engine designed by Grotter, but as this engine wasn't finished in time, it was instead fitted with a 300 horsepower M6 engine, giving a top speed of 22 miles per hour, which isn't too shabby for such a large tank. However, it does appear to be capable of running on wheels instead of tracks, so it's possible that the top speed is for wheeled mode, in which case the tank might be a bit slower on tracks. The armour also seems to be decent enough, maxing out at around 44 to 50mm, though it was lower in other areas. But it should allow it to stand up to shots from most small caliber weapons and even some medium caliber shells, especially at an angle or longer distances. Though it should be pointed out that at least one source states that the armour thickness was only 20mm, but again that was only one source, so I believe that one to be mistaken. In War Thunder, I think this has the potential to be an excellent tank, probably at 1.7 or higher, being equipped with 2 main guns, a good amount of armour and still possessing a decent mobility, as well as a good crew complement. And I could see this being a fairly popular tank for the Soviet tech tree, and I think it would do very well in game. In real life, the TG-1, while seeming to possess many good qualities and hoping to be delivered in large numbers, was ultimately undone by its high cost, with one source saying that 25 BT-2 tanks could be produced for the price of a single TG-1. So the project didn't progress much further, and Grotter himself returned to Germany in 1933, where it seems his love of massive tanks didn't go away and in fact got worse, with Grotter designing tanks of up to 1,000 tons, and even being involved with the P1000 design from World War II, though none of his designs would be built because they were obviously insane. And luckily the Soviets managed to avoid this obsession, but it is interesting to see that some of these designs originated from the Soviet Union in some way. So as you can see, the Soviets had a whole plethora of domestically designed light and medium tank designs that, while not perfect, could be refined over time and put into mass production. Yet they weren't. So why was this? Well, basically there was a bit of a debate on whether to rely on domestically designed tanks, even if they weren't necessarily the best designed, or to look at other nations for their tank designs. And so eventually the Soviets did decide to buy some tanks from Britain, these being the Carden-Loyd Tankette and the Vickers 6-ton, as well as the Vickers Medium Mark II. The Carden-Loyd would eventually be developed into the T-27 Tankette, while the Vickers 6-ton would be tested against the T-19 and found to be superior, so would be developed into the T-26, with over 10,000 eventually being produced. Bear in mind the United States only produced 35 tanks in total up to 1935, while the British Vickers medium tank production run was only in the hundreds. So Soviet industry was certainly showing the way in producing and operating tanks in large numbers, while still designing some tanks domestically, because of course the Vickers medium Mark II wasn't put into production and the T-28 instead was, though even that took some inspiration from British designs of the time, such as the A6 medium tank. The Soviets would also attempt to buy tanks from other nations, like the United States, which by 1929 was starting to loosen restrictions on the exportation of weapons that it had self-imposed in the aftermath of World War I. The design the Soviets were interested in was the T-1E2, an American light tank design that I have covered in the American Interwar episode, and was originally armed with either a short 37mm gun from the FT-17 or a 37mm semi-automatic cannon, while being fitted with 15.8mm of armour, a 2-man crew, and had a top speed of 16 miles per hour. So a decent if not spectacular design that might have given the Soviets some good service, and they planned to buy 6 to 8 examples. However, when the commission that was planning to buy the tanks arrived in America, they had a chance to visit the factory of Walter Christie's US Wheel Track Laying Corporation, where they were able to inspect his new M1928, which was a tank fitted with the new Christie suspension, that could reach a top speed of 42 miles per hour on tracks, but could also run without tracks to reduce wear and tear, and increase the top speed to 70 miles per hour, an unheard of speed for tanks of the time. The Soviet Commission was so impressed by this tank that they immediately recommended changing the plan from buying the T1E2 to buying this new Christie tank, which resulted in 2 examples being bought for $60,000 and a production license for $100,000. The 2 tanks would be shipped to the Soviet Union in December 1930 as tractors, and would be in Soviet hands by early 1931. Bearing in mind the US Army didn't receive their tanks until mid-1931, so the Soviets actually got them before the Americans. However, the 2 tanks were delivered without turrets, possibly to keep up the tractor ruse, resulting in $25,000 being returned as compensation, and meaning the Soviets would need to design their own turret. Which wasn't an awful setback, as the original turret was only armed with the 37mm gun from the FT-17, so would likely have needed upgrading anyway. The M1928, or M1940 as these examples were called, would be tested, and while some problems arose, it was decided to produce the tank at Kharkov as the BT-2 fast tank, the first of the iconic BT tanks that would lead to the BT-5 and 7 that we already have in game. There was also a BT-3 which basically just had metric measurements instead of imperial, and the BT-4 that used welded steel instead of rivets, but I don't think these should be included in game. So the BT-2 was now fitted with a new cylindrical turret that was armed with a 37mm B3 gun, which was more or less a copy of the German 37mm gun, and was a decent tank gun for the day, though the initial models lacked any sort of machine gun armament, so later BT-2s were fitted with a 7.62mm machine gun in a ball mount, fitted just to the right of the main gun. However, it turns out there was only enough 37mm guns for half the tanks, and it couldn't fit the 45mm gun, so the remainder were fitted with 3 machine guns, 2 in place of the main gun plus the ball mount, or just 2 machine guns with the ball mount being removed, but I don't think the machine gun version should be added in-game. The turret also provided an additional improvement over the original Christie design, as now 2 crew members could be fitted within the turret, bringing the total crew count to 3 instead of the 2 of the original M1928, which does provide a little bit more survivability for the tank in-game. As mentioned earlier, the original Christie design it was based off of was capable of high speeds, but the original tank was demonstrated without a turret and only steel sheets instead of armour. So once developed as a fully fitted out combat tank, the speed did naturally drop, now maxing out at 32 miles per hour on tracks or 44 miles per hour on wheels. But this is still a tremendous speed advantage over virtually every other tank of the period, other than the Christie tanks in service with the US Army, of which there were only a few. Lastly, the armour is understandably thin, maxing out at 13mm, enough to protect against machine gun fire, and some sloping is used to maximise the armour's effectiveness, but it's still not a tank that would stand up particularly well against any decent amount of firepower. In War Thunder, I think this would work very well at battle rating 1.0, being inferior to the BT-5 on account of that tank using the far more effective 45mm gun, but it would be very similar with the rest of its stats, and the 37mm gun will still be a decent weapon at the lower tiers, and it would be nice for the first Soviet BT tank to be represented in War Thunder. Ultimately, 620 BT-2s would be built from 1931 to 1933, but these didn't see combat until 1939, during the invasions of Poland and Finland, where they were largely superseded by the later BT-5 and BT-7 designs, and mainly suffered losses due to mechanical issues, which is not surprising considering the tanks were almost a decade old by this point. But the 323 tanks in service in 1941 were no match for the Germans during Operation Barbarossa, though some survived until 1943 on quieter fronts. It should also be noted that the Soviets also bought the Christie M1932 flying tank design, which was basically a tank that could be carried on a glider. But while it may be influenced later Soviet tank designs, this particular design itself didn't go into any sort of production. And interestingly, despite the Christie suspension being an American design, it would be through observing Soviet BT tanks that Britain would become interested in acquiring their own Christie tanks, which they would do later in the 1930s. Of course, with the Christie suspension working so well for the BT tanks, there was a hope that this might be replicated on other designs, such as the T26, which had a far slower top speed of 19 miles per hour, compared to the BT2's 32 miles per hour on tracks. To this end, it was decided to produce a design named the T46, which was basically a T26 with the Christie suspension fitted, but the initial prototype was a bit of a disappointment, as the top speed only increased to 25 miles per hour due to retaining the original 90 horsepower engine. But more prototypes were constructed with improvements, these being the 46-1, 2 and 3, with the 46-3 being chosen for further development and becoming the T46-1. And this was fitted with a 300 or 330 horsepower MT5 engine, achieving speeds of around 36 miles per hour on tracks or 50 miles per hour on wheels, while the hull and turret was also enlarged. Interestingly, it was fitted with a flamethrower to the right of the gun, though this might not have been installed in all tanks as some have the port plated over, while 2 machine guns were also carried, one in a coaxial position and one placed in the rear of the turret. Aside from these changes, it is basically the same as the regular T26, and I think in game it would make a good premium or event vehicle at 1.0 or 1.3, as it's now faster than the BT7 in game, though still retains the advantages and disadvantages of the original T26. In real life, the tank was a successful design, except in one regard, which was the cost, turning what was originally a fairly cheap light tank into a design that cost the same as the T28 medium tank, for not much gain other than speed. Thus, only the prototype and 4 production vehicles would be produced. Another design incorporating the Christie suspension would be the T29 medium tank, which in many ways seems to be an analogue to the T28, and the prototypes would be the T29 1, 3, 4 and 5, with apparently the T29 2 just being skipped over. These were to be armed with the 76.2mm KT-28 cannon, as used on the initial T-28, though this would later be replaced by the PS3 gun, which had a slightly higher muzzle velocity, thus would likely be a little bit more effective. As for secondary armament, the T-29 1 and 3 would have had 3 machine guns, one on the roof, one at the rear of the turret, and one in a coaxial position, while the T-29 4 and 5 would have had 2 extra machine guns in their own turrets at the front of the tank. Meanwhile, the armour starts off at just 15mm for the front and 13mm for the sides for the T-29 1, but improves to 20mm for the front and 15mm for the sides for the T-29 3 and 4, while the final T-29 5 prototype has 30mm frontal armour and 20mm of side armour, similar to the T-28. So while the earliest variants are a little bit more vulnerable to enemy shells, the last variant can stand up to some enemy firepower, though maybe not to a massive degree. As to be expected, there is some variance in the speed of this tank depending on the variant, with the T-29 1, 3 and 4 having a top speed of 37.2 miles per hour on tracks, or just under 50 miles per hour on wheels, while the T-29 5 has a top speed of 36 miles per hour on tracks, or 49 miles per hour on wheels, so a little bit slower but not drastically so, and with much improved armour. Lastly, due to the turret only being able to house 2 crew members, the first 2 models would have had 3 crew, a commander and loader in the turret and the driver in the hull, while the last 2 variants with the machine gun turrets would have had 2 additional crew members, bringing the total up to 5. So 1 less than the T-28, making the T-29 a bit easier to destroy than that tank. In-game, I could see some of the T-29 variants being premium or event vehicles, while some could be regular vehicles, probably at 1.0, with this being a much faster version of the T-28, able to get around the battlefield far easier, while retaining a similar armour and armament to the initial T-28. In real life, the T-29, while seeming to be a successful design, wasn't put into production, partly due to a desire to install a 3-man turret, which would have required a redesign, but primarily due to the high cost of the tank, which would have cost more than the T-28. And despite some changes, such as installing the length 10 76mm gun, the project was ultimately cancelled after the first few prototypes. So the Soviet Union had created a whole bunch of tanks and mass-produced them in hereto unseen numbers, with 10,000 tanks being produced by 1936, at a time when most other nations were producing tanks in the hundreds at the most. However, despite the large numbers, outside of a few border skirmishes on the Chinese border, they hadn't been proved in combat. This would change with the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, where the Soviets would finally have a chance to test them in large-scale combat, with T-26s and BT-5s being sent to assist the forces of the Spanish Republic in 1937. Here it was found that the armour of existing tanks was just far too thin, with the Soviet tanks' armour maxing out at only 15mm, barely an improvement over World War I era tanks, and these were now operating on battlefields where there were a lot more anti-tank guns, and these guns could easily penetrate this armour even at ridiculously long distances. This spawned a whole bunch of attempts to improve existing tanks with improved armour, with one attempt being the BT-SV, which was basically a BT-7 tank fitted with external armour plates of 10 to 12mm of steel positioned at extreme angles, though the production tank was meant to have plates of 20 to 25mm of cemented armour or 40mm of RHA, and in many ways the final design resembles the French FCM-36, and there is some suggestion that this design was based on that tank. All this armour of course meant some modifications like the removal of the rear fuel tank and unfortunately limited the ability to steer the tank in wheeled mode. The prototype was tested and accepted as the BT-SV2, but the armour doubled the weight compared to a regular BT-7, causing problems for the suspension and thus it never went into full-scale production. But it could still work well in War Thunder, possibly as a 1.3 or 1.7 tank, as it still has all the other stats of the BT-7, albeit it will probably be quite a bit slower. But with the added armour and unusual look, I could see it being a fairly popular tank for players to use, possibly as a premium or event vehicle. Another attempt would be with the T-111, sometimes referred to as the T-46-5, which was intended to be a light tank, yet ended up weighing 32 tons, so heavier than the T-28 medium tank, which was already a bit on the heavy side. The reason for this very large weight was the armour, which ranged from 20 to 50mm for the sides, and a whopping 60mm for the front, which is absolutely ridiculous for an interwar tank and basically makes this an earlier KV-1. Unfortunately, all this weight did impact the top speed, which was 19 miles per hour from a 300 horsepower engine, though this is still about the same as the T-26, so not awful by any means. However, the main gun is still only the 45mm gun as used on the T-26 and BT-7, which isn't a bad gun, but a larger gun had been desired, while 3 7.62mm machine guns were also carried, one in a coaxial position, one in the bow and one at the rear of the turret, while the crew complement was 3, consisting of a driver, commander and loader. In War Thunder this would be a very good premium or event vehicle, probably at around 2.3 to 2.7, and it would probably function a bit like the later Sherman Jumbo tanks, having a very good amount of armour but maybe being a little bit outclassed with regards to the gun, and being a bit on the slow side and being disadvantaged by its 3-man crew. But I think this would still be a very fun tank to play in War Thunder. In real life, the resulting design definitely met the criteria of being shell-proof, being all but immune to practically every existing anti-tank gun of the day, but the lack of a larger gun would have meant redesigning the vehicle to fit a larger turret, which was a bit of a problem along with the high weight, so only 2 prototypes were constructed before it was cancelled. Of course, while these tanks didn't go into mass production, lessons were learnt from them, which brings us to the A-20 or BT-20, which was a design that combined the armour scheme of the BT-SV and design features from the BT-IS, which was a design that improved on the chassis and suspension of the BT tank. This new tank design was headed up by Mikhail Koshkin at the Kharkov plant, and as you might guess from the picture, is the forerunner to what would become the T-34, with the sloped armour providing crater protection against enemy shells. However, the armour thickness of the hull is only 20mm. So while sloping does provide additional protection, the armour is still too thin to stand up to many contemporary anti-tank weapons, and especially those that would be developed in the future. The hull was also widened, allowing for the addition of another crew member and bringing the crew up to 4. While the gun used is the same 45mm gun as on the previous BT tanks, and the engine used is now a V12 diesel engine, making this vehicle less susceptible to fires while providing a top speed of 46.6 miles per hour. This would be a very decent tank to have in game, either as a regular or premium vehicle, having a decent top speed, good gun and improved survivability from the extra crew member, while the sloped armour helps to maximise this thin armour, making this a decent tank for around 2.3. So the A20 was a pretty good design, but Koshkin felt that a better design could be produced. So on his own initiative he had set out to design what would become the A32, so named due to its use of 32mm of armour instead of the A20's 20mm, while the 45mm gun was to be replaced with a length 10 76.2mm gun as used on the later T28s. It was also decided to do away with the ability to run the tank on just tracks, which seems like a bit of an odd decision, but remember, while in theory these did give much higher top speeds, running on the wheels was very rarely done in practice and only really possible to do on good quality roads. And while this was also meant to help with reliability had greatly improved in the last 10 years, so the added complexity from being able to run on wheels was just not really needed. The resulting design was practically as mobile as the A20, but was much better protected and armed, and both designs were put through testing and found to be superior to the existing BT7. But of course the A32 was the design chosen to go into production, though with thicker armour of 45mm and named the T34, the year that Koshkin had first thought up the idea for the new tank. Unfortunately, Koshkin would die from pneumonia that was contracted while testing the T34 in 1940, so he never got to see it have a great impact in World War II. In-game, I think the A32 would be a great tank for 3.0, having decent armour, mobility and firepower, and basically just being an earlier T34 with thinner armour and a slightly less effective gun, making this a great tank for those looking to get some experience on how the T34 will play, and allowing this unique tank to have a place in War Thunder. Of course, the Soviets also worked on some heavy tank designs that aren't already included in-game, one of these being the T100, which was a multi-turreted design that looks rather similar to the SMK. Unfortunately, sources for this seem a bit sparse compared to the SMK, but it was armed with the length 10 76mm gun in the upper turret, which was Superfire in the lower turret armed with a 45mm gun, while 3 DT machine guns were also carried. The armour was surprisingly thick, being at least 60mm thick, though some say up to 70mm, though unfortunately it's also not that quick, with a top speed of around 20 miles per hour, and a crew of at least 6 and possibly up to 8. This could fill a similar position in War Thunder as the SMK at a battle rating of around 3.3, being a big heavy tank with thick armour, but rather slow and fitted with a slightly less effective main gun. The T100 was put through testing alongside the SMK, and even fought in the Winter War against Finland, but both designs would be outclassed by the KV-1, which would of course go on to be adopted, though the T100 did survive in a sense, as the chassis was used for the Su-100Y SPG already in-game. So that's about it for regular Soviet tanks, but there is at least one decent Soviet amphibious tank that could be added in the form of the PT-1, which was partially based on BT tank components, with the hull itself being larger than on the BT-2. Stats-wise, it would have very thin armour, much like the BT tanks, and seems to be armed with a 45mm gun. And while not adopted for service in real life, it would probably have some good success in War Thunder, and it would be nice to let the Soviets have a very low-tier amphibious tank. There are also quite a few SPGs that could be included, for example the Su-45 and AT-1, both being relatively small light tank destroyers, with the Su-45 based on the T-38 amphibious tank and armed with a 45mm gun, and the AT-1 being based on the T-26 chassis and armed with the 76.2mm PS3 gun, both vehicles being deadly opponents in the lower tiers. An attempt was also made to fit the PS3 gun to the BT-2, becoming the D-38, which would give this vehicle a very deadly weapon while still maintaining excellent mobility. Lastly, there is also the option for heavy-hitting SPGs in the form of the two Su-14 variants, the initial Su-14 being built on the T-28 chassis, while the Su-14-1 would be built on the T-35 chassis. Initially, a massive 203mm B4 howitzer would be used on the Su-14, but this would later be changed to a 152mm gun, though the fire rate was extremely slow at 1 round every 5 minutes or so, but of course we know that firing rates can sometimes be artificially lowered like on the Sturmtiger, while the firing platform was completely exposed. However, with an eye of using them during the Winter War, the Su-14 and 14-1 would later be given an armoured compartment of up to 60mm thick, giving some good protection but making the already slow and ponderous vehicle even slower. That said, they would be quite fun vehicles to use in War Thunder, and would be cool meme vehicles to have in the game. While in real life the Su-14-1 still exists to this day in the Kubinka Tank Museum. So that's it for this episode on Soviet interwar tanks I would like to see added to War Thunder. I'd be interested to see your views on these vehicles and any other tanks you'd like me to cover in the comments below. As for the next episode, I'll probably be covering either Japanese or Italian interwar tanks next, so I hope you're looking forward to that. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I've been Tyranno, and I'll see you next time.